Stakes meeting taking place in the shadow, of course, of the war in Iran. It is Wednesday night, of course, back in the U.S. Thursday morning here in the Chinese capital of Beijing. China pulling out all of the stops, giving President Trump the red carpet treatment. Following the arrival ceremony, the two leaders will begin their bilateral meeting discussing trade, technology, and, of course, Iran. We have seen President Xi here moments ago coming down the stairs here, the red carpet laid out, awaiting the motorcade and President Trump. The president receiving a warm welcome when he stepped off of Air Force One, greeted by children waving Chinese and American flags. This summit originally scheduled for last month, President Trump postponing the meeting, of course, because of the war in Iran. He had hoped by now to arrive in China with momentum from declaring victory and ending the war. Instead, talks between the U.S. and Iran remain at a stalemate. The Strait of Hormuz remains closed. Gas prices in the U.S. hitting their highest level in 4 years. Of course, causing a ripple effect through the U.S. economy and really the global economy. China, an ally of Iran, gets fuel from Iran. China provides goods used by the Iranian government. There's been some question as to whether China has helped Iran with parts for weapons as well. President Trump expected to urge President Xi to pressure Iran into agreeing to U.S. terms to end this war. President Trump now arriving. You're looking at live pictures here. You can see the motorcade bringing the president, set to shake hands now with President Xi. The U.S. delegation already assembled here off to the side, watching the greeting here of these two world leaders. The world's two biggest economies, obviously together for this summit, looking to solidify their trade truce as of late. But as I mentioned, the war in Iran looms large over this summit. This is the first visit by a U.S. president to China since President Trump's trip 9 years ago. The two leaders are expected to talk about trade. They're expected to talk about artificial intelligence, technology. They'll talk about business. Part of the U.S. delegation here, as you can see, includes business leaders from back in the United States. Elon Musk, of course, of Tesla, SpaceX. Tim Cook of Apple, we could see there in the U.S. delegation as well. Jensen Huang, who runs NVIDIA, of course. He boarded the delegation, boarded Air Force One in Alaska, but it stopped for refueling. Huang has asked for loosening export restrictions on AI chips in the U.S. to China. That has led to some questions from some who wonder if China would then use that technology to try to catch up to the United States on artificial intelligence. They now approach the U.S. delegation. President Xi shaking hands. The Treasury Secretary, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary Hegseth also here in attendance. President Trump's son, Eric Trump, his wife Lara, also part of the U.S. delegation. You can see as President Xi makes his way down the delegation, shaking hands. President Xi faces his own challenges here in China, economic challenges, high youth unemployment, consumer demand has weakened here in China. And of course, they're dealing with their own version of this energy shock from the Iran war. President Trump said before this trip that technically Iran is not on the agenda, but even the president, Mary Bruce, acknowledged that Iran would be coming up.
In fact, David, the administration, despite the fact that President Trump insisted that he is not going to be asking President Xi for his help in ending this war, the administration says that they do want China to play, in the words of Marco Rubio, a more active role in trying to end this war. This is not the visit, certainly, that President Trump had initially envisioned. As we see him now, they're standing side by side, walking these two superpowers, meeting here today. And what different circumstances from the last time they met. As you mentioned, the president had envisioned that he would arrive here today victorious in Iran, that he would use that momentum to help secure deals on trade and technology, other investments and artificial intelligence, that this was a chance to reset the U.S. relationship with China. But those ambitions now largely overshadowed by the war with Iran. We are now seeing what looks to be the beginning of quite a ceremonious welcome here for President Trump.
Our chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce. Mary, thank you. Stick with us here. And As Mary mentioned, this is the welcome in the shadow there of the Great Hall of the People here in Beijing. Let's listen. White House team. Stand by, Selena. We'll come to you in a moment. We'll listen in a little bit more here. Eyes of the world on these two leaders, and as I mentioned, Selena Wang is here with us. She lived in China as a journalist before joining our White House team. And Selena, the question is, both of these leaders face challenges in their respective countries. There are the children. He was greeted upon arrival, getting off of Air Force One, the president was, with Chinese flags, American flags, and now the children of China greeting President Trump and President Xi again. And Selena, of course, the question is, what will come of this summit? What will be the deliverables, as they're called, when these leaders are done?
Well, David, we are seeing all of the pomp and circumstance, as you're pointing out. China really rolling out the red carpet for President Trump. It is historic. It's the first time we're seeing a U.S. president step foot in China in nearly a decade. President Trump himself was the last one nearly 10 years ago. In terms of those deliverables, David, both of these leaders, they want to walk away with some wins that they can tout to their people. President Trump, for his part, he wants headline trade deals. Beijing to promise to buy American planes, agricultural products, as well as energy technology. We could also see the creation, I'm told by administration officials, of a board of investment and trade to manage economic exchange on less sensitive economic areas. Now, for Beijing's part, they want to focus on one key word, and that is stability. They want to keep America off of its back so that they can fortify themselves, become stronger, and what that means is a longer tariff truce. They do not want another tit-for-tat trade war. They want an easing of restrictions on high technology exports, as well as easier access to investments in the U.S. And David, when it comes to the Iran war that is looming large over all of this, Beijing can afford to be patient here and wait this out. The Trump administration wants Xi Jinping to intervene, but he really sees this as America's problem to solve, David.
Selena, as you know, before leaving the White House, President Trump insisted he does not need President Xi's help in ending the war. As I mentioned, this is the seventh the two leaders are meeting in person. This is President Trump's second trip to China, of course, as we've mentioned here, the first during his first administration. That was in 2017. And as Selena mentioned, both of these leaders want some measure of victory coming out of this summit. And even though President Trump said Iran will not officially be on the agenda, the Trump administration is certainly hoping to convince China to put pressure on Iran to agree to some sort of resolution here to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. They will argue it is in China's best interest as well, since China does get some of its fuel from Iran. But China has demonstrated, at least so far, that it prefers to remain on the sidelines when it comes to applying any kind of pressure on Iran to do anything to come to a resolution. Britt Clennett also watching our coverage right along with us. She's live in Hong Kong right now. Britt, you've covered Taiwan for many years for us. And of course, China's foreign minister has made it clear that Taiwan will be on the agenda for them. President Trump acknowledged that he expects China will bring up Taiwan. He said he will listen to them. But senior Trump administration officials say expect no changes when it comes to Taiwan from the U.S.
Yeah, look, David, I've stood not far from where those two leaders are meeting right now, President Trump and President Xi. You know, in September, Xi Jinping had this extraordinary display of his new weapons as he was standing there flanked by Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, showing off his stealth drones, his missile technology. Many people signaling that this was an indication that he was, you know, ready or preparing to take over Taiwan, which considers itself a self-ruled island. China considers it part of China. China wants to see a softening on the U.S. stance towards Taiwan. The U.S. government officially acknowledges that China views Taiwan as part of its territory, but does not express a stance on whether it agrees. This is also intentionally vague about whether it would intervene to defend Taiwan if China sought to annex it by force. So the language is very important to China, you know, around what it means to support Taiwan, one China principle versus one China policy, from not supporting Taiwanese independence to outright condemning Taiwanese independence. These things really matter to the Chinese. Taiwan is the reddest of red lines, as you know, David, for China. China has ramped up its exercises around the island and vowed to take the island by force if necessary.
China has said that, yes, it would take Taiwan by force if necessary. Britt, thank you. President Trump acknowledged coming into this summit that he did expect the Chinese to bring up Taiwan, as they usually do during these meetings and certainly during summits. In fact, President Trump was asked just this week about selling arms to Taiwan, and the president said that President Xi would like us not to, and I'll have that discussion with him. That's one of the many things we'll be talking about. James Longman, our chief international correspondent. James, President Trump has long described his relationship with President Xi as a warm one. He has said these two leaders are connected, that beyond the optics of these meetings, these summits, that there are many telephone calls. And of course, as we know, this is President Trump's second summit and the first return of a U.S. president since his first term. Now in the shadow of the Great Hall, walking up those stairs with President Xi. Certainly larger than the shadow of the hall, though, the shadow of the war in Iran that rages on with a stalemate in the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, David, in many ways, this is where Donald Trump likes to be, a superpower alongside him, making decisions that affect the world, that impact people around the globe. But we are watching all this during an incredibly expensive game of chicken over Iran. And the big question, who's going to blink first? How much more pain can Iran take from the U.S. blockade on Iranian ports, which, by the way, is working? I mean, the U.S. blockade is hurting Iran. The U.S. Navy does have incredible power to shut down energy imports. Just look at what the U.S. has been able to do in Venezuela, in Cuba. The Navy chases down any ship that goes to or from Iranian ports. And as we've heard multiple times, Beijing, of course, is the main customer for Iranian oil. But also the big question, how much more pain can the U.S. take from high gas prices created by the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz? And in many ways, you know, the Iranians have realized they don't need a weapon of mass destruction, a nuclear weapon. They've got this weapon of mass disruption over the Strait of Hormuz. I'm reminded of an Economist magazine front cover last month, which attributed a quote to Napoleon Bonaparte, which said, "Never interrupt your enemy when he is making a mistake." That feels like China's strategy right now.
James Longman, our chief international correspondent, as we watch the two leaders enter the Great Hall, and as you heard James say, that the American blockade in the Strait of Hormuz certainly has been effective, though the ripple effect back home is significant. And Rachel Scott, our chief political correspondent back in the U.S., watching this unfold with us. Rachel, the president said in the last 24 hours when asked if the pain in the economy that the Americans are feeling back home when it comes to gas prices, if that's a factor in his decision-making in the war in Iran. And his answer made immediate news, not only in the U.S., but globally.
It did, David, and the president was very blunt. He made it very clear that he's not factoring in how Americans are dealing with this war financially, ultimately into his decision-making on whether or not to make a deal with Iran. But let's be clear here, David. The president and Republicans, they are looking for some sort of policy win. The president there in China, he's facing economic headwinds back here at home. We've talked about these gas prices on the rise amid the war with Iran. And you know, the president has insisted there's plenty of other policy to talk about there in China. This is certainly looming large. Iran's foreign minister was just in China just a few days ago, meeting with his Chinese counterpart. We're in a critical midterm election year, and Republicans are also facing headwinds heading into November, especially in the House of Representatives. So Republicans are hoping there is some sort of economic win that comes from this, something that could sell back home, back in their districts as they're campaigning, get back on the road. They're looking for some sort of victory, and especially when it comes to trade, David. We know so many American farmers were shut out for much of 2025 from China purchasing American soybeans. They have since resumed that since the trade agreement that was reached months ago, but still, that still definitely has lasting impacts back here at home, David.
Rachel Scott watching our coverage here today. The two leaders now inside the Great Hall here in Beijing, and we are awaiting our first images of the two of them. They will hold a meeting, a bilateral, inside the Great Hall. The first of 2 days for this summit. The president will also join President Xi tomorrow for a tea and a working lunch before he heads back to Washington. There will be a dinner later today. And as we await these first images coming out of this summit, our chief foreign correspondent, Ian Pannell, is also with us for our coverage today. Ian has covered the war in Iran extensively since the beginning of the war. And Ian, there's no question that as the world watches these two leaders, and they would like this to be about trade, about two economies, and certainly with this U.S. delegation including Elon Musk and Tim Cook and the head of NVIDIA, who was added at the last minute. Certainly the U.S. wants the world to focus on the economic parts of this summit, but everyone very aware of the global impact of this war in Iran.
Yeah, I think that's right, David. I think even actually not just the war in Iran, I think in some senses the contrast between President Trump's first meeting with President Xi and the situation today, 10 years later, is very stark. In some senses, this is a diminished America. I think its influence, if not its power, is now in serious doubt, not just from its adversaries, but also from its friends. I mean, President Trump failing to end the war between Ukraine and Russia, China, of course, an ally of Vladimir Putin. And as we're talking right now, Ukraine again under massive attack by Russia, which has been going on for 24 hours. And as you say, in Iran, the U.S. failing to achieve a strategic victory. Now stuck in a conflict with no easy way out. The president can't just walk away from it because he hasn't achieved any of his clear war aims. And even if he continues bombing, it's very unclear that he will achieve any of these key points that he set out. And here in Europe, I think Trump is at odds with his old allies, not just because of his threats over Greenland, but his peak over the lack of support for his Iran war. Europe standing on the sidelines, not seeing what the value of the war was. The general view here, I think, is that this was a war of choice. It's brought nothing but economic misery for not just the old world, but especially Asia. David?
Ian, thank you as always. And we're looking at pictures here, and of course, we would love to know what they're saying. Secretary of State Marco Rubio pointing to the ceiling inside this meeting room, inside the Great Hall. You saw Secretary Hegseth there, Secretary Bessent off in the distance. The president will meet with President Xi in this bilateral meeting before he then tours the Temple of Heaven a bit later today here. Again, Wednesday night back in the States, Thursday morning here in Beijing. The Temple of Heaven dates back to the 15th century, followed by a state banquet here tonight. Secretary Bessent, you can see standing there. He's leading this delegation, this trip. You know, the last time these two leaders met, President Trump and President Xi, the agreement to come out of that meeting was that China would buy soybeans from America, some 12 million tons of soybeans, 25 million tons annually. Here are the two leaders now. And then there was an agreement to halt the back and forth on trade tariffs that had hit tariffs as high as 145% from President Trump. There's some unfortunate words there a moment ago. We're not entirely sure what the tension is being captured by some of these press pool cameras. The president now has taken his seat next to Secretary Rubio, Secretary Hegseth there. Rubio keeping his eye to the door.
做一个致辞，然后请
asking the control room now. Unclear if we're going to have a translator for the press pool here. Do we know? I'm being told by the control room that we do not know yet whether as part of this press pool coverage we'll have translation of President Xi right here. But let's listen.
再次访华，我们的会面现在可以说是举世瞩目。当前百年变局加速演进，国际形势是变乱交织，世界走到新的十字路口。中美两国能不能跨越所谓的修昔底德陷阱， 开创大国关系的新范式，能不能携手应对全球挑战，为世界注入更多的稳定性？能不能着眼两国人民的福祉和人类前途命运，共同开创两国关系的美好未来？这些可以说是历史之问、世界之问、人民之问，也是我同您作为大国领导人需要共同书写的时代答卷。今年是美国独立250周年，我向你和美国人民表示祝贺。我始终认为，中美之间的共同利益大于分歧，中美各自成功是彼此的机遇。中美关系稳定是世界的
Mr. President, I look forward to our discussions on major issues important to our two countries and the world, and working together with you to set the course for and steer the giant ship of China-U.S. relations, so as to make 2026 a historic landmark year that opens up a new chapter in China-U.S. relations. I will pause here and hand over to you, Mr. President. Thank you.
Well, President Xi, I want to thank you very much. First of all, that was an honor like few I've ever seen before. And I think I was particularly impressed by those children. They were happy. They were beautiful. The military is obvious. It couldn't be better, but those children were amazing, and they represent so much. And I know they represent so much to you. You and I have known each other now for a long time. In fact, the longest relationship of our two countries that any president and president has had. And that's, to me, an honor. We've had a fantastic relationship. We've gotten along. When there were difficulties, we worked it out. I would call you, and you would call me. And whenever we had a problem, people don't know, whenever we had a problem, we worked it out very quickly. We're going to have a fantastic future together. Such respect for China, the job you've done. You're a great leader. I say it to everybody. You're a great leader. Sometimes people don't like me saying it, but I say it anyway because it's true. I only say the truth. And I just want to say on behalf of all of the great delegation that we have the greatest businessmen, the biggest, and I guess the best in the world. We have amazing people, and they're all with me. Every single one of them, we asked the top 30 in the world, every single one of them said yes. And I didn't want the second or the third in the company. I wanted only the top. And they're here today to pay respects to you and to China. And they look forward to trade and doing business, and it's going to be totally reciprocal on our behalf. So I really look very much forward to our discussion. It's a big discussion. There are those that say this is maybe the biggest summit ever. They can never remember anything like it. I can say in the United States, people aren't talking about anything else. But it's an honor to be with you. It's an honor to be your friend. And the relationship between China and the USA is going to be better than ever before. Thank you very much. Thank you.
There you have it. President Trump accepting the invitation, greeting President Xi there, calling President Xi a great leader, saying people back in the States get upset with him for saying that. Some people, he said, but he will say it anyway. He also pointed out that he brought business leaders from the United States and said to President Xi of China, "We have the best in the world." Now huddling there, conferring with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, talking about trade, business, the economy. There with President Xi, but of course a lot of the other issues that will come up here, including the economies of both countries, the war in Iran, whether or not China will be willing to try to influence Iran at all, Taiwan, artificial intelligence, chips, of course, microchips used for technology, many questions moving forward, rare earth minerals and materials, also a sticking point between these two countries. Much to discuss, much to continue to cover here. But there you have it, the greeting of the two leaders, President Trump, President Xi, and their summit here in Beijing. I'm David Muir. We'll continue to report this out. The latest on Nightline, Good Morning America, and of course, I'll see you right here for World News Tonight, this time tomorrow night. From all of us here at ABC, thanks for watching. Have a good evening. Good night.
This has been an ABC News special report.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Linsey Davis. Thanks so much for streaming with us. It is Thursday morning in Beijing, and President Donald Trump welcomed by Chinese President Xi Jinping. We can see them earlier tonight shaking hands there at the Great Hall of People as this high-stakes summit now gets underway. Lots of pomp and circumstance. Both leaders value displays of strength, pageantry, and nationalism. A ceremonial and cordial greeting that we observed between the two world leaders. Lots of smiles during an otherwise typically tense time. President Trump with lots of praise for President Xi, touting a fantastic relationship between the two, saying that they will have a fantastic relationship currently and will have a great future together. Calling President Xi a great leader, though he said that some people in the United States don't like to hear him say that. He's going to say it anyway. But he said that the relationship is going to be better than ever before. Both have historically projected personal respect publicly, even while the relationship is often confrontational and frosty at times. Trump has praised Xi's strength and intelligence while also accusing China of unfair trade practices in the past. But no mention of that tonight, no mention of the Iran war, no mention of Taiwan. But we will hopefully be able to get a readout at some point of the conversation that ensues between the two leaders now behind closed doors. For now, I do want to send it over to our chief White House correspondent, Mary Bruce, who's traveling with the president in Beijing. Mary, what would this trip need? What would need to happen in order for this trip to be determined as a success for President Trump?
Yeah, it certainly is a good question, Linsey, because I think the pleasantries that we just heard from both leaders, the pomp and ceremony that we just saw, certainly stand in stark contrast to the real challenges that face this conversation here. I think it's striking, just the visual of this. You're not seeing the two leaders sitting side by side, sort of chummy in armchairs, as we often see at some of these bilateral meetings. That is quite a stark image of the two of them with their delegation sitting wide apart at this grand, huge table in this rather ornate hall. And I think it does speak to sort of the distance that they need to overcome here. I think when it comes to what a success would look like, obviously the issue overshadowing all of this is the war with Iran, of course, a close ally of China. And while President Trump publicly has insisted he doesn't need President Xi's help to end this conflict, we know that he is likely to press Chinese President Xi to urge Iran to come back to the negotiating table and to finally reopen the Strait of Hormuz. I think one of the many questions here this evening, is what would China want in return? Economically, the president is also looking to secure some kind of investments that he can tout back at home, well aware, of course, of the ripple effects of this war in the U.S. economy. Despite the president dismissing some of those concerns publicly, he is hoping that China will announce some big purchases of U.S. soybeans, of Boeing aircraft. He, of course, has brought that large entourage of powerful American business leaders with him as well. So the president is looking for some kind of deals on trade, technology, investments that he can bring home as sort of a feather in his cap. But the real focus is going to be on whether they are able to make any progress towards ending the war in Iran, and of course whether the détente between these two superpowers that has prolonged and lasted since their last meeting last fall, whether that will continue and what concessions it will take from both sides to bring that about, Linsey.
And of course, Mary, we were expecting to see this meeting of these two world powers weeks ago, and that was, of course, postponed because of the ongoing war in Iran, now well into its third month. How can China help the U.S. in attempting to end this war, and will they choose to get involved? Because we see that China has really very much acted as Switzerland, really staying on the sidelines and not wanting to participate.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, certainly China has sway. They are a close ally of Iran. They're actually the largest purchaser of Iranian oil. So they, too, are suffering from the Strait of Hormuz being closed and the ongoing American blockade. But look, China has made it pretty clear they feel that this is a war of President Trump's making, and they have wanted to keep a certain distance from all of this. Now, it is possible that the President Trump, will be able to convince them to play, as Marco Rubio said, a more active role in trying to bring about an end to this conflict. But what will China want in return? Will they want the U.S., for instance, to sort of soften its stance towards Taiwan, possibly back away from arms sales? Of course, you know, the president has admitted that Taiwan is something that is likely to come up here, but in what way, shape, or form? There are just so many questions about how this is going to go forward, whether China is willing to put its foot sort of more into this fight, and what they can do to try and sway Iran ultimately, and whether it will have an impact.
President Trump said there tonight in front of President Xi that all anybody can talk about back in the United States is this visit. But many are still talking about just yesterday when President Trump said he doesn't think about Americans' financial concerns when it comes to trying to make a deal with Iran. How has that been sitting both in China and the United States?
Yeah, look, I think it is easy to see that statement has not gone over well. We have seen Republicans, even the vice president, sort of trying to do some cleanup after the president suggested that the financial squeeze that Americans are feeling isn't a motivating factor when it comes to whether or not he's pushing for a deal with Iran. I think the president eager to show that he's not going to be swayed by anything when it comes to how he negotiates with Iran. But the administration now saying, of course, the president, understands and sympathizes with Americans' financial hardships. In fact, the vice president admitting today that they do have some work to do in order to deliver, he said, on the prosperity that the American people deserve. He said the president is hyper aware of this. Those were the vice president's words. And the president knows that he has to do something to show Americans that he is, trying to alleviate that financial pain. It's why he's hoping to secure some kind of deals here. But until this war ends, it doesn't see that there's any end in sight for these spiking gas prices, which, of course, are rippling through so many other things, everything from the price of beef to tomatoes to coffee now rising. In fact, Americans seeing the cost of living rising to the highest levels in 3 years. And so all of this the president is well aware of. But, Linsey, so too are the Chinese. And it is part of the reason that the Chinese feel that they have the upper hand going into these talks. They know that President Trump is facing a war that is now unpopular back at home, and that Americans are suffering financially because of the ripple effects of this ongoing conflict, which continues to be at a stalemate.
Yeah, Trump certainly not arriving with the leverage that he thought he would have. Now, Trump tonight also praised his relationship, saying that he's had the longest relationship than any other American president with President Xi. They've had an interesting relationship over the years. Where does it stand now?
Yeah, it is really interesting to hear the President Trump really heaping praise on Chinese President Xi, describing him as a dear friend. Think about what a departure that is from the way that President Trump used to speak about China, especially during his first run for the White House, when he really cast China as a #1 threat to America, to the U.S. economy, and promised to tackle that head on. Now the president, has described him as a dear friend. He has said that they have a special relationship. He's described him as a tremendous guy, but he is also aware of the many conflicts between them. But the president has described this as a friendly competition. It is certainly, and the president well aware that he is saying these things publicly on camera. The question is whether all of that flattery will ultimately get the president what he wants, Linsey.
And we should know that in a few days, ultimately, we imagine we'll hear some kind of a readout there. Mary Bruce, our thanks to you there in Beijing. We're joined now by Britt Clennett, who's in Hong Kong. And Britt, how does the war in Iran and the U.S. invasion in Venezuela, in a way, help Xi's efforts with Taiwan?
Well, look, China is obviously wanting to bring the issue of Taiwan up. Trade is important. The issue of Iran will come up. To what extent will China pressure Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, which it wants to do, but it also recognizes in terms of from where it's standing that the U.S. Launched an illegal war on Iran and that it's responsible for closing the strait to begin with. So I'm not convinced about how much pressure it will want to exert on Iran there. But certainly for China, Taiwan is front of mind. It wants to see a softening on the U.S. stance towards Taiwan. We know that U.S. officials ahead of this visit said there won't be. But the U.S. government, it does officially acknowledge that China views Taiwan as part of its territory, but it doesn't actually express a stance on whether it agrees to that. You know, this is also intentionally vague about when it comes to would it intervene to defend Taiwan? Would it step in if China sought to annex the self-ruled island by force? The language here is important to China. You know, is there some kind of shift when it comes to one China principle versus one China policy, from not supporting Taiwanese independence to outright condemning Taiwanese independence? These things very much matter to the Chinese. Taiwan is the reddest of red lines for China. China has ramped up exercises around Taiwan. Recently, it's vowed to take the island by force if necessary. And Taiwan, for its part, continues to buy weapons from the U.S. Trump says they need to buy more weapons, but certainly this is probably something that Xi Jinping wants to press Trump on. Taiwan's internal politics, they often debate how much money to allocate to buying arms from the U.S. You know, some people I speak to say that they're not convinced that the U.S. would actually come to its aid if China actually does invade Taiwan. And the Taiwanese officials I speak to, they say they're watching all this very, very closely. You know, I've been embedded with the Taiwanese military in islands just a stone's throw away from China. They're simulating attacks from air, sea, and land using howitzers, anti-tank missiles to practice how to defend itself if that does happen. So certainly we know that they would be outnumbered. They have issues in terms of mobilization. China has an overwhelming advantage in terms of size. But China is hoping it can take the island peacefully. It says it wants opposition, the opposition which is more favorable to the mainland to win the next elections. But you know, most Taiwanese see themselves as Taiwanese, and they're very proud of their identity and the freedoms that they do enjoy.
It strikes me as you're talking, Britt, that is there perhaps a trade-off between the two countries, or is it not of equal weight? If you say, let's say Xi says to President Trump, hey, stop selling these weapons to Taiwan, and on the other hand, President Trump says, hey, get Iran to open up the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, I think that's what Taiwan is afraid of, whether it's going to be a bargaining chip here. You know, it sees itself in between a rock and a hard place. It doesn't see itself as having much power or any kind of negotiating power in any of this. You know, many Taiwanese say that they don't want Taiwan to turn into Hong Kong, for China to turn around and say, you know, you can have one country, two systems. We'll let you have the freedoms that you still enjoy. Well, look what happened to Hong Kong. You know, the freedoms have deteriorated here. They're from a thriving free press, seeing there is no independent press here. You know, any kind of protest or opposition to China has been snubbed out. So certainly, you know, Taiwan is looking at this anxiously, despite those promises from the administration that the language won't change, that the stance won't change. Certainly there's a lot of anxiety from the Taiwanese side that there might be some kind of, as you say, exchange.
Britt Clennett, thanks to you. And coming up, inside China's AI industry, where the race to lead on this technology is on. And back here in the United States, a stunning decision by South Carolina Supreme Court overturning Alec Murdaugh's double murder conviction and life sentence. The details on the new trial that's now been ordered.
If this were a Hollywood movie, what would be your perfect story?
We'd be lying if it wasn't Premier League or something like that. Why not dream big?
Wrexham is just one step away from the top league of world football.
Make no mistake, it is cutthroat.
Just reminding you to breathe.
We're in with it, big boys now.
I'm in love.
FX's Welcome to Wrexham premieres May